Before the story begins, before the fire and the famine, before the battles and the broken treaties, there is silence. A silence that lies across the land like mist, soft and eternal. It is the silence of fields stretching endlessly toward the horizon, of rivers winding patiently through forests, of villages sleeping beneath a wide and watchful sky. Ukraine, a borderland, a crossroads, a place where worlds have always collided. Here, the soil is rich, black, and endless. Here, armies have marched, empires have risen and fallen, and entire generations have been carried away by the storms of history. And yet, the land remains. The land always remains. This is a story not only of war, but of memory. Of how the ground beneath our feet remembers more than we can bear to speak aloud. Of how each blade of grass, each stone, each ripple of water carries within it the weight of what has come before. To walk here is to walk upon layers of centuries, some buried deep, some still raw and bleeding, some waiting to be unearthed by those who will come after us. The story you are about to hear is not linear. It is not a march from beginning to end. It is a circle, a spiral, a recurring dream. It will move like the wind across the steppe, sometimes whispering, sometimes howling, sometimes vanishing into silence before returning again. You may find yourself drifting as you listen. That is as it should be. This story is not meant to be consumed quickly, but absorbed slowly, like rain sinking into earth. The voices of the past are not in a hurry. They have waited centuries to be heard, they can wait a little longer. So settle in. Let the rhythm of the words carry you. Let the images wash across your mind like shadows cast by a flickering fire. Let the story seep into you like roots into soil. For this is not merely the story of a war. It is the story of a land that remembers. A land that bleeds, and heals, and bleeds again. The new bloodlands of the 21st century. Ukraine. It begins with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of memory. The kind of silence that hangs over fields at dusk, when the air is heavy with the scent of earth, when the wind carries faint echoes of voices that no longer exist. This silence is old, older than nations, older than kings. It is the silence of a land that has endured too much, the silence of Ukraine. Imagine the vastness of it. Wide horizons, where the wheat fields stretch endlessly, where the steppe seems to merge with the sky, where the rivers wind like veins of silver across black soil. From a distance it looks calm, eternal, almost serene. But beneath the surface lies something else, the weight of centuries, the burden of conquest, the memory of loss. This land remembers everything. Ukraine. The borderland. A threshold between worlds. For as long as people have spoken its name, it has meant the edge. The edge of empire. The edge of civilization. The edge where East and West collide, not gently, but violently. Always caught in between, always desired, never left alone. And so the land became a crossroads of armies, a corridor of ambition. The nomads of the steppes came first. The Scythians rode across the grasslands, leaving burial mounds that still rise from the plains like silent watchmen. The Sarmatians followed, and after them, the Pecheneg and Cumans, tribes whose names are now little more than whispers in forgotten chronicles. Their horses thundered, their arrows darkened the sky, and then they vanished into history, leaving only silence behind. Then the Mongols came, and their coming was like a storm. In the 13th century, Kiev, proud, radiant Kiev, the mother of cities, was reduced to ashes. Its churches burned, its libraries destroyed, its people slaughtered or scattered. The Golden Gate crumbled, the bells fell silent, and the city that had once been the heart of the Chivan Rus lay broken. The Mongol storm moved on, but the scar remained. Even today, one can walk through Kiev and feel, in some deep corner of the soul, the echo of that fire. For centuries after, Ukraine was pulled between competing powers. To the west, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, vast and glittering, spread its reach. Castles rose upon hills, Catholic processions wound through towns, noble estates ruled over the lives of peasants. To the east, Moscow's power grew slowly, relentlessly, until its shadow stretched further and further west. Between them stood the people of Ukraine, farmers, villagers, free riders of the steppe, caught between allegiance and defiance, survival and rebellion. It was in this crucible that the Cossacks were born. Fierce, independent, untamed. They rode the rivers, settled the wild frontiers, and carved out their own republic of freedom and danger. Their songs still echo, songs of rebellion, of battle, of drinking and death. To empire they were both weapon and threat. To the people, they were symbols, proof that life could be lived beyond the chains of lords and tsars. The Cossack uprising shook the Commonwealth, frightened the tsars, lit sparks of independence that would never fully die. But rebellion was always met with repression. Treaties were signed, promises made, and just as quickly broken. Borders shifted. Ukraine was divided, carved into pieces, absorbed by empire. By the 18th century, much of it lay under the Russian crown, its autonomy extinguished, its language declared lesser, its culture forced into silence. Yet the people remembered. They carried their songs in secret, their prayers in whispers, their stories in the quiet of winter nights. A nation endured not in palaces or armies, but in the hearts of peasants who refused to forget who they were. The 19th century brought no relief. The Tsar's empire tightened its grip, pulling grain from Ukrainian fields to feed its growing cities, drawing soldiers from villages to fight in distant wars. Yet at the same time, seeds of renewal were planted. Poets like Taras Shevchenko gave voice to the voiceless, reminding the people that their suffering was not meaningless, that their language was not shameful, that their land belonged to them. His verses became more than poetry. They were resistance, memory turned into fire. Still, the weight of empire pressed down. The 20th century arrived not with peace, but with new storms. The First World War swept across Ukraine like fire through dry grass. German troops, Russian troops, Austro-Hungarian troops, each left ruin behind. Villages burned. Fields stripped bare. Famine followed. And in the chaos, Ukraine glimpsed independence, fragile and fleeting. For a brief moment after the Russian Revolution, the Ukrainian People's Republic stood, declaring sovereignty. But it was smothered quickly, crushed beneath the boots of the Red Army, absorbed into the newborn Soviet Union. The dream flickered and died, but it was not forgotten. Then came a tragedy so vast that even silence struggles to contain it. The Holodomor. The famine of 1932–33, engineered by Stalin's regime. Grain was seized, quotas imposed, villages starved into submission. The black soil, fertile and abundant, yielded nothing for its own children. Families collapsed in their huts, mothers watched their children wither, fathers dropped dead in the fields. Entire villages disappeared. The number of the dead is counted in millions, but numbers cannot tell the story. Only silence can. A silence that still lingers, heavy and unbroken, across the fields of Ukraine. And then, as if famine were not enough, came war. The Second World War turned Ukraine into a theater of unimaginable violence. Nazi Germany invaded, Soviet armies retreated, and the land became once again a battlefield of empires. Babin Yar, a ravine outside Kiev, became a grave for tens of thousands of Jews, shot and buried in just 2 days. Villages were burned alive. Millions were conscripted, millions deported, millions killed. The soil was soaked in blood until it seemed that nothing could grow but death itself. When the Soviets returned in 1944, they called it liberation. For many, it was merely another form of occupation. Suspected collaborators were punished. Entire populations were deported. Ukrainian nationalists were hunted, their resistance driven underground. The war had ended, but the suffering did not. The silence that followed was not peace, but repression, the silence of a people forced to bury their memories deep within their hearts. And yet, still, the land endured. The people endured. In their songs, in their churches, in the stubborn pride of their villages. Through all the cycles of conquest and famine and war, Ukraine endured. At last, the Soviet Union collapsed. Independence came suddenly, in 1991, as if history itself had cracked open and allowed a long-buried dream to rise into daylight. Ukraine was free, on paper, in name, in law. But freedom is never simple. The old shadows remained. The old questions returned. Would Ukraine turn to the West? Would it fall again under Russia's influence? Could it define itself, at last, as its own master, its own nation? And so the ancient pattern repeated. A land between empires. A threshold, once again. The 21st century did not bring safety. It brought new ambitions, new struggles, new wars. And in these new wars, the soil remembers the old. Because here, in Ukraine, history never dies. It sleeps, lightly, restlessly. Every explosion awakens it. Every trench uncovers it. Every grave dug today touches another grave dug long ago. This is why Ukraine feels haunted. Because it is. It is haunted by centuries of conquest and resistance, of famine and rebellion, of silence and survival. It is haunted by the voices of peasants and poets, of soldiers and mothers, of children who starved and soldiers who fell. It is haunted by memory. And in the end, that memory is what makes Ukraine unyielding. Empires have marched across its soil, burned its villages, silenced its people. But they have never succeeded in erasing it. Ukraine endures because it remembers. This is the land between empires. The land of silence, of ghosts, of survival. The land that carries the weight of history into every moment of its present. The land that is now, once again, the stage of a war that is both new and old. The land that has become the new Bloodlands of the 21st century. The soil of Ukraine is black. Rich, fertile, endless. Farmers call it Chernozem, the black earth, the gift of centuries, the envy of empires. It is earth that can feed millions, earth that has been called the breadbasket of Europe, earth so deep and dark it seems almost alive. But this soil holds more than grain. It holds memory. It holds blood. When you walk across the fields of Ukraine, you do not walk upon ordinary ground. You walk upon a layer of centuries. Beneath the wheat, beneath the grass, beneath the flowers that bloom each spring, there are bones. Countless bones. Soldiers who fell in forgotten battles. Villagers who starved in famine. Families who were driven into pits and shot. Generation after generation, buried into the same earth, pressed down by time until the soil itself became heavy with memory. This is why the land feels haunted. It is not imagination. It is truth. The earth is saturated with history. Every handful of dirt carries fragments of lives that came before, lives cut short by conquest, by hunger, by war. The soil of Ukraine is black because it has been fed not only by rain and sun, but by suffering. For centuries, the earth was both gift and curse. It fed empires, but it also drew them here, again and again. The Tsars wanted the wheat, the Soviets wanted the grain, the Nazis wanted Lebensraum, the land for themselves. And each time, the people who tilled the soil became expendable. They were starved, deported, enslaved, exterminated, all so that someone else could claim what was beneath their feet. The cycle repeated most cruelly in the 20th century. In the 1930s, Stalin's regime demanded impossible quotas. Grain was seized, barns emptied, even seed grain stolen from peasants who begged for mercy. Trains carried the harvest away, but nothing remained for those who had grown it. Entire villages were left with nothing but bark, grass, and dust to eat. The Holodomor, the famine, descended. Children lay still in their huts, mothers dug in the fields for roots, fathers collapsed in silence. Roads were lined with bodies. And through it all, the black earth waited, absorbing each fallen life, each unmarked grave, each secret burial. No monument was raised then. No prayers allowed. Only silence. The famine was denied, erased from official history, yet the soil remembered. It always remembers. Then, scarcely a decade later, came war. The German invasion of 1941 brought slaughter beyond imagining. Ukraine became a landscape of death. Mass graves were dug in forests and ravines, bullets fired into crowds, villages set ablaze. The ravine at Babin Yar filled with the bodies of tens of thousands of Jews in just 2 days. Across the countryside, German soldiers and their collaborators left ruin behind. And when the Soviets returned, their vengeance was merciless. Deportations, executions, suspicion cast on entire communities. Once again, the land drank the blood of its people. Once again, the soil grew heavier. It is said that during the Second World War, so many soldiers died on Ukrainian ground that even decades later, farmers turning their fields would find bones, helmets, rusted weapons. A skull unearthed by the plow, a bayonet rising from the soil. Even now, in the 21st century, these relics surface. The ground refuses to forget. But blood in the soil is not only the mark of death. It is also the mark of endurance. Each generation that fell gave strength to those who followed. Each life buried became a root, deep and unbreakable, holding the people to their land. To leave Ukraine is to leave behind the graves of ancestors, the memories tied to every hill and river. The soil is both burden and bond. This is why the people return, again and again, even after exile, even after war. They return to the soil that holds their dead, the soil that has kept their memory alive. They plant wheat, they sing songs, they tell stories, even when silence is demanded. Because to abandon the soil would be to abandon themselves. In the 21st century, the soil bleeds again. Trenches are dug in fields that once grew sunflowers. Rockets crater orchards. Mines are buried where children once played. The war that rages now is not only above the earth, it is within it. Every shell that explodes uncovers remnants of old wars. Every new grave touches the edge of an older one. Soldiers fighting today sometimes stumble upon bones from battles long past. Time collapses. History surfaces. The dead refuse to stay buried. And as the bombs fall, the soil swallows them, layer upon layer, memory upon memory. New blood joins the old. The black earth grows darker still. There is a strange stillness to this. A rhythm almost ritualistic. The land is given life, the land is taken by death. Wheat grows, wheat burns. Families plant, families starve. Soldiers march, soldiers fall. And always the earth absorbs it, without judgment, without end. This is why the war in Ukraine feels different, why it resonates with such unease. It is not only a political conflict, not only a struggle for territory. It is something older, something deeper. It is history itself, returning. It is the soil calling forth its memory, demanding to be heard. The blood in the soil is not forgotten. It seeps upward, invisibly, into the present. It shapes the way people see themselves, the way they fight, the way they endure. It is what makes the war not merely about maps, but about existence. To defend Ukraine is to defend the graves of its ancestors, the memory of its famines, the silence of its massacres. To lose Ukraine would be to lose everything, to lose the very ground that holds its story. And so the war continues, and the land absorbs it, as it always has. Black soil, fertile soil, heavy soil. Soil that grows wheat, soil that hides bones, soil that remembers every drop of blood. If you walk across a Ukrainian field at dawn, when the mist hangs low and the earth is damp with dew, you might feel it, that weight beneath your feet. Not just the weight of earth, but the weight of memory. It is inescapable. The soil speaks without words. It whispers of hunger, of fire, of silence. It whispers of endurance. And in that whisper lies the truth of Ukraine, a nation rooted not only in life, but in death. A nation carried not only by the living, but by the dead who remain in the soil, generation after generation. This is why the land can never be conquered. Armies can march across it, borders can shift, governments can rise and fall. But the soil will always belong to the people who have bled for it, who have been buried in it, who have fed it with their suffering and their strength. Ukraine is not just a land. It is a graveyard. Ukraine is not just a graveyard. It is a seedbed. From blood, from silence, from memory, life returns, again and again. The soil endures. The people endure. The ghosts endure. This is Ukraine. This is the blood in the soil. There are moments when the land seems quiet. The fields sway gently with wheat, the rivers shine in the evening sun, and villages hum with the small rhythms of daily life, children laughing, women singing old songs while they work, men repairing tools, planting, harvesting, waiting for the seasons to turn. From a distance, it looks like peace. The kind of peace that feels eternal, unbreakable, certain. But in Ukraine, peace has always been an illusion. Beneath the laughter lies memory. Beneath the songs lies silence. Beneath the stillness lies unease, as though the earth itself knows that the quiet cannot last. For centuries, Ukraine has been granted these intervals of calm, pauses between storms. They come like seasons, but never endure. A war ends, and families return to their homes. Graves are dug, wounds bandaged, fields replanted. Children grow, villages rebuild, churches ring their bells again. Life resumes its slow rhythm. But the peace is never whole. It is fragile, thin, like glass over water. At any moment, it can shatter. And when it does, the silence beneath it rises again. After the Mongols burned Kiev in the 13th century, survivors rebuilt. They tilled the soil, they prayed in new wooden churches, they sang. For a time, it seemed as though peace had returned. But it was only the quiet before the next invader, the next fire. When the Cossacks secured brief moments of autonomy, their republics flourished. They traded, they wrote laws, they dreamed of a free Ukraine. But the peace was short. Empires encircled them, treaties unraveled, wars erupted. The Cossack lands fell back under foreign crowns. Even in the 19th century, under the heavy hand of the Tsar, there were moments when life seemed ordinary. Villages bustled with markets, harvests filled the barns, folk songs carried across the night. But repression simmered. Languages were banned, freedoms erased, identities suppressed. The peace was only the silence of submission, not the reality of freedom. The 20th century repeated the pattern with cruel precision. After the famine of the 1930s, there was quiet. Families who survived returned to their fields. Children grew. The black earth yielded crops again. From a distance, it looked like peace. But the famine's silence was not peace, it was repression, fear, denial. The dead were not spoken of. The truth was buried. The survivors carried their grief silently, unable to speak, unable to mourn. It was not peace. It was trauma, pressed deep into the soil. When the Second World War ended in 1945, there was quiet again. Soviet flags flew over cities, factories hummed, fields were tilled, schools opened. People told themselves the nightmare was over, that life could begin anew. But the scars remained. Villages destroyed by fire were rebuilt on ashes. Families torn apart by deportation sat around tables with empty chairs. The silence in homes was heavy, but unspoken. The official story said peace had come, victory had been won, liberation was complete. But the people knew better. They carried their wounds in silence. The post-war Soviet decades appeared stable, almost calm. The state controlled life, but for many, survival meant acceptance. Streets filled with parades, children learned songs of the motherland, collective farms grew wheat, factories produced steel. On the surface, there was order. On the surface, there was peace. But beneath it all, discontent simmered. Identity was suppressed, voices silenced, faith driven underground. It was a peace maintained by fear, by conformity, by denial. An illusion, fragile and false. When independence came in 1991, the illusion took a new form. For the first time in centuries, Ukraine was free, a sovereign nation. The people celebrated. Flags waved, songs filled the air, a dream long buried seemed at last to rise. For a moment, it felt like true peace. But independence did not erase the shadows. Economic hardship came quickly. Corruption spread. Old allegiances tugged the country in different directions, east or west, Russia or Europe, the past or the future. The illusion of peace cracked with every political crisis, every protest, every confrontation. The Maidan Revolution of 2014 shattered it completely. Blood spilled again, echoing the cycles of centuries past. And then came war. The illusion of peace is dangerous because it lulls the soul. It whispers that suffering is over, that history has been silenced, that ghosts have been buried. But in Ukraine, history does not sleep deeply. It stirs beneath the surface, restless, waiting. Each time peace arrives, it is already ending. Each time silence spreads, it is already cracking. The people of Ukraine know this, even if they do not always speak it aloud. It lives in their songs, in their stories, in their cautious eyes. They plant crops, they rebuild homes, they raise children, but somewhere deep within, they carry the knowledge that the peace is temporary. That at any moment, the horizon might darken with the approach of another storm. This is why the present war feels inevitable, as though it is not new but merely the latest turn of the cycle. A false peace broke, and the violence beneath it rose again. The illusion shattered, as it always does. If you stand in a Ukrainian village at dusk, when the light fades and the sky turns soft and gray, you might feel it. A strange unease. The air seems too still, the silence too deep. It feels peaceful, but it is not. It is waiting. The land is always waiting. For footsteps, for fire, for history to return. This is the tragedy of Ukraine, and its strength. Peace is never given, only borrowed. Life is lived not in the certainty of safety, but in the knowledge of endurance. What others mistake for peace, the people of Ukraine know to be only the pause between battles. The illusion of peace is thin, fragile, already cracking. But still, they live, they endure, they sing, they plant. For even an illusion can give rest, however brief. And so the cycle continues. Silence, storm, silence again. The illusion of peace, shattered, reborn, shattered once more. Always fragile. Always fleeting. Always haunted. This is Ukraine. This is the illusion of peace. The Iron Curtain was meant to be impenetrable. A wall of silence. A fortress of ideology. A prison built not of stone, but of fear. For decades, the Soviet Union draped its shadow across Ukraine. Its banners proclaimed unity, progress, triumph. Its statues rose high in city squares, its slogans echoed through schools, its portraits hung in every office, every classroom, every factory hall. The Iron Curtain sealed the country, cutting it off from the outside world, protecting it, so the leaders claimed, from the corruption of the West. From a distance, it seemed unbreakable. The machinery of the state hummed like clockwork, the parades marched in perfect rhythm, the newspapers spoke in a single voice. The system appeared eternal, invincible, unshakable. But no wall is without cracks. And in Ukraine, the cracks were always there, hidden beneath the surface, widening slowly, silently, year by year. The first crack was memory. No propaganda could erase the truth carried by the survivors. Families whispered of the famine, the purges, the deportations. In official history, these events were distorted, minimized, or denied. But in kitchens, around tables late at night, the stories were told in hushed voices. Children grew up listening, even if they pretended not to hear. These memories lived in silence, but they lived. The Iron Curtain could not seal them away. Another crack was faith. Churches had been closed, priests arrested, icons hidden. The state declared religion a superstition, a relic of the past. Yet in secret, candles still burned. Baptisms took place quietly, in kitchens or forests. Old women clutched rosaries in their pockets, whispering prayers when no one was watching. Faith went underground, but it did not die. It survived like an ember under ash, waiting for the wind to stir it again. There were cracks in culture, too. The Ukrainian language was pushed to the margins, replaced by Russian in schools, in government, in the army. But in villages, mothers still sang lullabies in Ukrainian. Folk songs lingered, tales were retold, poems were copied by hand and passed quietly among friends. Writers who dared to resist, poets, dissidents, samizdat publishers, were silenced, imprisoned, exiled. Yet their words spread anyway, whispered from one reader to the next. Each poem, each story, each banned book was another fracture in the wall. And there were cracks in the soil itself. The land remembered. In the west of Ukraine, forests still held the memory of partisans who had fought both Nazis and Soviets. Old bunkers lay hidden beneath moss and earth, but people knew they were there. In the east, fields scarred by famine held their secrets beneath the crops. In every region, the ground itself was restless, unsettled, carrying histories that could not be erased. By the 1970s, the Iron Curtain was still standing, but the cracks were visible if one looked closely. Factories belched smoke but fell into disrepair. Collective farms produced grain, but inefficiency rotted the system from within. Bureaucrats repeated slogans, but few believed them. The empire looked solid, but inside it was hollow. In Ukraine, dissent grew quietly. Writers and intellectuals demanded cultural freedom. Students staged small protests. Underground movements circulated pamphlets, recorded forbidden songs, held secret meetings. Most were crushed, but each act left a mark. The KGB watched, arrested, silenced, yet resistance continued, like water seeping through stone. And then, in 1986, came Chernobyl. The explosion at the nuclear plant tore a hole not just in the reactor, but in the illusion of Soviet power. The authorities lied, delayed, denied. They told the people nothing, while radioactive clouds drifted over villages, over cities, over children playing in the sun. Soldiers marched into the zone without protection. Families were evacuated too late. The silence of the state became unbearable, poisonous. Chernobyl was a crack that could not be hidden. It revealed the weakness of the empire, its disregard for human life, its reliance on secrecy. In Ukraine, it deepened the mistrust, widened the fractures. People no longer believed the slogans. They began to see through the illusion. The Iron Curtain, once a wall, was now a veil, and behind the veil, the empire was rotting. By the late 1980s, the cracks spread everywhere. The Soviet economy faltered. Food lines stretched down city streets. Empty shelves mocked the promises of abundance. Meanwhile, voices grew louder, demanding independence, demanding freedom, demanding truth. In Lviv, Kiev, and other cities, rallies began. Flags long hidden were raised again. Songs once forbidden filled the air. The curtain was tearing. And with each tear, more light poured through. The state tried to hold it together. But the cracks had become too many, too deep. No empire can last forever when its people have stopped believing. And so, when the Soviet Union finally fell in 1991, it seemed sudden to the outside world. But in Ukraine, the collapse was not sudden at all. It was the inevitable breaking of a wall that had long been fractured, splintered, undermined by memory, by faith, by culture, by truth. The Iron Curtain did not fall in silence. It cracked, it groaned, it split apart piece by piece, until at last it collapsed into dust. What remained was Ukraine, standing amid the ruins of empire, breathing free air for the first time in generations. But freedom is fragile. And even as the curtain fell, new shadows gathered on the horizon. The ghosts of empire do not vanish so easily. They linger, watching, waiting for their return. The Iron Curtain is gone. But the cracks it left behind still shape the land. They are etched into memory, into culture, into politics. They remind Ukraine that freedom is never secure, that empires do not die quietly, that the past is never fully past. This is the legacy of the cracks. This is the price of endurance. This is the shadow that remains. In the north of Ukraine, among quiet forests and gentle rivers, there once stood a place that was meant to embody the promise of progress. Chernobyl. To the Soviet Union, it was a monument to modernity, a nuclear power plant, a triumph of science, a beacon of the future. Its towers rose above the trees, its reactors hummed with energy, its workers were told they were building the tomorrow of socialism. Electricity flowed from Chernobyl across Ukraine, across the empire, a symbol of power drawn from the very heart of the atom. But beneath that promise, something darker was waiting. The night of April 26, 1986. A test. A failure. An explosion. In an instant, the future became ash. The reactor core burst open, releasing fire and invisible poison into the air. A plume of radiation drifted across the skies, carried by wind and rain, settling on fields, on rivers, on villages still asleep in their beds. At first, there was silence. The authorities did not speak. They told the people nothing. The parade in Kiev continued as planned. The children marched, the crowds gathered, unaware that an invisible storm was falling upon them. Mothers held their babies in the sunlight, while the air itself was laced with death. Chernobyl was not only a disaster of science. It was a disaster of truth. The Soviet state, trained in secrecy, reflexively concealed the catastrophe. Officials whispered among themselves, but not to the people. The curtain of lies was pulled tighter, even as the radiation seeped through every seam. For days, villagers near the plant lived as if nothing had happened. Children played in gardens, cows grazed in meadows, families drank milk already contaminated. Only later, too late, came the evacuations. Buses arrived to take entire towns away, hurriedly, suddenly, with promises they would return soon. But they never returned. Their homes remain empty still, swallowed by forests, frozen in time. Pripyat, the shining workers' city, stands silent even now. The Ferris will never turn. The schools are abandoned, chalk still on the blackboards, toys scattered on the floor. A whole world left behind in an instant, preserved in radioactive dust. Chernobyl became a shadow across Ukraine's soul. It revealed what the people had long suspected but rarely spoken aloud, that the empire cared more for appearances than for lives. That the state could sacrifice truth, sacrifice safety, sacrifice its own citizens, if it meant protecting the illusion of strength. The crack in the Iron Curtain became a gaping wound. People no longer believed. They could not. They had seen with their own eyes the sickness, the evacuations, the soldiers sent to die cleaning the ruins with shovels and bare hands. They had seen the villages erased from maps, the forests turned red with radiation, the ground poisoned for generations. Chernobyl was not just a disaster. It was a revelation. And yet, the shadows linger. Even today, the zone of exclusion lies silent, a scar on the land. Wolves roam through empty streets. Trees grow through windows. Rust creeps over the carnival rides, the factory machines, the apartment blocks left behind. The silence of Chernobyl is not empty, it is full of memory, of absence, of things that cannot be forgotten. The people who once lived there carry the shadows with them. Children born sick, families displaced, lives shortened. The survivors speak quietly, their voices edged with pain. Chernobyl is not past, it is present, a slow poison that seeps into history itself. And beyond the physical ruin, there is the deeper shadow, mistrust. The people of Ukraine learned that the empire would not protect them. That the empire would lie, even as they suffered. That survival meant relying not on the state, but on one another. The shadow of Chernobyl is not only in the soil and the trees, it is in the very relationship between people and power, between Ukraine and the empire that ruled it. Some say Chernobyl ended the Soviet Union. Not immediately, not visibly, but slowly, like rot beneath a painted wall. It revealed the weakness, the decay, the indifference. It showed the people what they had always suspected, that the empire was hollow. That its promises were empty. That it could not endure. And so, when independence came, Ukraine remembered Chernobyl. It remembered the betrayal, the silence, the abandonment. The shadow of Chernobyl whispered, "Never again." But shadows have a way of returning. Today, Chernobyl is more than a place. It is a warning. It is a symbol. It is a ghost. It haunts Ukraine, and it haunts the world. For Chernobyl is not only about radiation. It is about truth. It is about power. It is about the cost of silence, the price of lies, the danger of empire. The land around the reactor remains poisoned. But so too is the memory, the trust, the relationship between people and those who rule them. The shadow stretches across decades, across generations, across the very identity of a nation still struggling to free itself from empire's grasp. Chernobyl was the end of one world, and the beginning of another. A reminder that progress can carry destruction, that silence can kill, that empires fall not with thunder, but with a whisper of lies. The shadows of Chernobyl remain. They will remain for centuries. In the soil. In the forests. In the hearts of those who remember. Ukraine carries this shadow still. And in its struggle today, the shadow whispers again, a reminder of fragility, of betrayal, of endurance. Chernobyl was not the end. It was a warning. And the world has not yet learned it. Independence came not with fireworks, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. The Soviet Union dissolved like a vast structure eaten hollow from within, collapsing under its own weight. And Ukraine, after centuries of empire, suddenly stood alone. It was 1991. The flag of blue and yellow was raised. The anthem, long whispered in exile and memory, was sung aloud. For the first time in generations, the word freedom was not only a dream, but a reality. Yet freedom, like dawn, arrives not in blazing light but in slow, uncertain hues. The new Ukraine was fragile, hesitant, burdened with the weight of its past. Factories that had once served Moscow's plans stood silent. Workers who had built tanks, missiles, and machinery found themselves adrift in a new world of scarcity and uncertainty. The fields were fertile still, but the markets were broken, the chains of trade severed, the lifelines cut. The Soviet Empire had vanished, but its shadow remained. The structures of power were not so easily erased. The bureaucrats stayed in place. The oligarchs, once party loyalists, reshaped themselves into masters of business, controlling industries, media, politics. Independence had come, but corruption came with it, heavy and suffocating. In those first years, hope and despair walked side by side. The streets of Kiev, Lviv, Kharkiv, and Odessa filled with both celebration and disillusion. On one corner, students painted walls with the colors of a new flag, on another, pensioners sold their medals for bread. Families gathered around televisions to watch the West, to dream of Europe, to wonder if their country could become something different. But in the silence of winter kitchens, with cupboards empty and wages unpaid, those dreams often froze. Ukraine was independent, yes, but independence alone was not enough. The Russian shadow stretched long. Gas pipelines tied Ukraine to Moscow's will. Russian media flooded the airwaves. Politicians swayed between loyalty to the East and longing for the West. Every election was not only a vote, but a struggle for the country's soul, East or West, past or future, Empire or Europe. And then came the Orange Dawn. It was 2004. An election, rigged and corrupted, had placed Moscow's candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, in power. The people knew. They had seen the fraud, the manipulation, the lies. And so, they rose. From the villages, from the factories, from the universities, they came to Kiev. They filled Independence Square, wrapped in orange scarves, holding candles, singing songs that their parents and grandparents had once feared to sing. They came not only for democracy, but for dignity. Not only for politics, but for truth. The square glowed orange with banners, with fires, with hope. It was not violent. It was not war. It was a gathering, a vigil, a demand. The people stood in the cold, through nights of frost, through days of uncertainty, their breath rising in the air like smoke, their voices rising into the winter sky. And for once, power yielded. The fraud was overturned. The election was held again. The people's choice, Viktor Yushchenko, scarred by poison in an attempt to silence him, became president. The Orange Revolution had succeeded. The dawn had come. But dawn is not the day. The orange glow faded. Hope, so bright in the square, dimmed in the corridors of power. The new leaders, once united by protest, became divided by ambition. Promises of reform gave way to infighting, to compromise, to stagnation. The people who had stood in the cold, who had sung for a new Ukraine, watched as the old shadows crept back into place. Disappointment settled like mist. The dream of a truly new Ukraine seemed always to slip away, just beyond reach. The orange banners, once so bright, faded in the sun. And yet, something had changed. The people had learned their power. They had learned that they could stand, together, and force change. They had learned that the empire's shadow could be resisted, that truth could prevail, if only for a moment. The orange dawn may have faded, but it planted something deeper, memory, courage, the knowledge that Ukraine's destiny was not fixed, but could be fought for. And so, the 1990s and 2000s passed in unease. A nation caught between empires, between dreams and disappointments, between promises and betrayals. Independence had been won, but freedom had to be guarded. Every step forward was contested. Every reform was resisted. Every hope was tested. The Orange Revolution was not the end of the struggle. It was a beginning, fragile, uncertain, flickering like the first light of dawn. Ukraine had awoken. But the day ahead would be long, and the shadows of empire had not disappeared. They lingered, waiting. The dawn had come. But storms were gathering. For the struggle for Ukraine was not over. It had only begun. The story of Ukraine bends like a river. It flows forward, yet always circles back, carrying echoes of what has already passed. The orange dawn had promised a new morning, but the light was fragile, and the shadows of old empires crept back across the land. By 2010, the promise of change had faded. The banner of reform lay in tatters. Into power returned Viktor Yanukovych, the very man once rejected by the people, now seated upon the presidency by way of elections shadowed with manipulation, promises, and silent pressures from Moscow. For a while, it seemed as though the past had won. Ukraine leaned back toward Russia. The oligarchs strengthened their grip. Corruption, once challenged, spread like ivy over the walls of government. The people, weary of disappointment, sank again into quiet resignation. The fire of the Orange Revolution dimmed, glowing faintly like embers buried under ash. And then, a single spark. It was November 2013. Yanukovych stood poised to sign a long-awaited agreement with the European Union, a document that symbolized Ukraine's shift toward Europe, a bridge to the West. The people watched with hope. But at the last moment, under the heavy hand of Moscow, Yanukovych refused. He turned away from Europe. He turned back to Russia. For many, this was not merely a betrayal. It was a breaking point. The dream of Europe, fragile and distant, was stolen in an instant. And so, the students of Kiev gathered in the Maidan, Independence Square. They carried no weapons, only flags, signs, and songs. Their voices filled the winter air. Ukraine is Europe. We want dignity. We want freedom. What began as a gathering of youth became something greater. Thousands poured into the square. The cold was sharp, but the people stood together, shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in scarves, holding candles, sharing food. They sang through the night. It was a vigil of hope, of stubbornness, of quiet defiance. But the state responded with violence. In the dead of night, police descended on the students, beating them with batons, scattering them with blood and fear. The images spread across the nation. The brutality was undeniable. And what had begun as a protest became a movement. By morning, the Maidan was not a square of students, it was a city of the people. Tents rose. Barricades were built. Churches sent priests to stand among the crowds. Old men brought wood for fires, mothers brought food, veterans brought experience. The square became alive, a breathing organism of resistance. The beating of drums, the chanting of slogans, the glow of fires, it was not only a protest. It was a world within a world, a living declaration that Ukraine would not surrender its dignity. Weeks stretched into months. The Maidan held. Snow fell on the tents, on the barricades of wood and metal, on the helmets of men and women who stood watch at night. The air smelled of smoke, of burning tires, of frost. The voices never ceased. The people sang hymns, recited poetry, prayed together. It was a revolution of spirit as much as of politics. And yet, the violence grew. The government, threatened, unleashed its riot police, the Berkut. The crack of stun grenades, the hiss of tear gas, the thud of rubber bullets filled the square. Protesters fell. Some wounded, some never rising again. Still, the people did not leave. With every beating, every death, more came. Villages sent buses of farmers. Factories sent workers. Veterans of Afghanistan and Chechnya stood on the barricades. Even priests stood between the riot police and the people, holding crosses, their voices trembling with prayer. The Maidan had become sacred ground. And then came the fire. February 2014. The square erupted into a battlefield. Snipers positioned on rooftops fired into the crowds. Protesters, armed only with shields of wood and metal, fell one by one. Blood stained the snow. The fires burned higher, columns of black smoke twisting into the cold sky. The world watched as the center of Kiev became a vision from another age, a medieval fortress of barricades, flames, and defiance. Over 100 lives were taken in those days. They came to be called the Heavenly 100. Ordinary men and women who stood for dignity and paid with their blood. Their photographs, their names, their faces remain etched into the memory of a nation. The violence could not break the Maidan. Instead, it broke the regime. Yanukovych fled, vanishing into the shadows, carried away by Russian protection. The government collapsed. The people had won, but the cost was carved into the soul of Ukraine. The Maidan was not simply a protest. It was a crucible. It burned away illusions, leaving behind something harder, sharper, more enduring. It revealed that Ukraine was not simply a pawn between East and West, but a nation willing to fight, to bleed, to die for its own future. The fires of the Maidan still glow, long after the barricades were torn down. The square itself became a place of pilgrimage, of memory, of mourning and pride. And in the silence that followed, one truth remained: Ukraine had chosen its path. But the empire does not surrender so easily. The moment Ukraine turned westward, the shadows moved from the east. The Kremlin watched, unsettled, enraged. And soon, the storm would come. The Maidan was the spark. But what followed was fire across the land. The Maidan burned itself into memory, a cathedral of fire and sacrifice, and when the smoke drifted away from Kiev, the world held its breath. But history, in this land, does not rest. It shifts, it mutters, it opens old wounds that never heal. And even as the tents were cleared from Independence Square, even as candles still flickered for the Heavenly 100, another shadow rose in the south. Crimea. A word heavy with centuries of struggle, empire, and myth. The peninsula is a jewel of the Black Sea, its shores kissed by salt and sun, its hills draped in vineyards, its mountains rising above deep blue waters. To the eye, it seems timeless, a place of peace, where the waves erase the footprints of conquerors. But beneath the beauty lies a story of conquest layered upon conquest, a palimpsest of blood. Greeks, Scythians, Tatars, Ottomans, Russians, all had claimed it. And in the heart of this land, in the city of Sevastopol, Russia had anchored its Black Sea fleet for generations. Crimea was not just territory. It was symbol. It was memory. It was power. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Crimea remained within the borders of newly independent Ukraine. Yet it was never settled. The population leaned toward Russia, the naval base tied it to Moscow's ambitions. And for Russia, losing Crimea had been a wound that never closed, a humiliation of empire, a reminder that history had slipped from its grasp. So when Maidan toppled Yanukovych, when Ukraine turned its gaze westward, the Kremlin acted. Not with open declaration, not with the thunder of armies rolling across borders, but with something quieter, stranger, more unsettling. Men without insignia appeared on the streets of Crimea. They wore uniforms but bore no flags. They carried weapons but no names. The world came to call them little green men. They moved swiftly, methodically. Airports, government buildings, communication hubs, all were seized without warning, without bloodshed at first. The local authorities, confused or complicit, offered little resistance. Within days, Crimea was under Russian control, though no war had been declared. It was a theft in plain sight, a shadow swallowing the land before the world could react. And then came the referendum. Hastily arranged, conducted under the watch of armed men, it offered a choice that was no choice at all. Russia claimed overwhelming support. Ukraine, powerless to intervene, cried foul. The West watched, issued condemnations, imposed sanctions, but the facts on the ground had already hardened. Crimea was gone. For Ukrainians, it was a wound upon a wound. The blood of Maidan had not yet dried, and already the land was torn. The peninsula, with its Tatars who remembered Stalin's deportations, with its mixed families, with its harbors and resorts, was severed. The maps shifted overnight. What had been Ukrainian was now, once again, in Moscow's grasp. But it was not merely land that was lost. It was the sense of safety, the belief that borders were firm, that the world would honor them. That illusion dissolved like mist over the Black Sea. And the Tatars, the ancient people of the peninsula, who had once been exiled en masse to Central Asia by Stalin, felt the fear return. They knew what it meant when Russia came. They remembered the trains, the camps, the erasure of culture. Some resisted quietly, refusing to recognize the annexation. Others fled. And the silence of their exile seemed to whisper again across the hills of Crimea. The annexation of Crimea was not just a move on the chessboard of geopolitics. It was the opening act of something far darker. For if Moscow could take Crimea without war, without punishment, what else could it take? The peninsula was not the end. It was the beginning. Already, in the east of Ukraine, strange men appeared. Flags unfamiliar began to flutter. Rumors spread of uprisings, of separatists, of support flowing in from across the Russian border. Crimea had fallen like a stone into the sea, and the ripples were spreading outward. But Crimea itself, the land, the soil, the shoreline, remained what it had always been, a place of haunting beauty bound to haunting history. The vineyards still bore fruit. The waves still broke gently on Yalta's beaches. The cliffs of Sevastopol still rose above the fleet. Life went on, but beneath it all was a new silence, heavy and uncertain. For Ukraine, the peninsula had become a ghost, visible on the map of memory but absent from the map of power. A stolen jewel. A reminder that the storm was far from over. And beyond Crimea, in the industrial heartland of Donetsk and Luhansk, the fire would spread. The war that Ukraine had long feared was no longer a possibility. It was already on its way. The fall of Crimea was a lightning strike, sudden and blinding. But what followed in the east of Ukraine was not sudden. It was slower, like fire smoldering in the depths of coal, unseen at first, then spreading through the seams, until the whole mine glows red. This fire was Donbass. The Donetsk Basin, or Donbass, is a land carved by industry. Black earth and blacker coal, smokestacks and slag heaps, rail lines cutting across fields. Here, the soil does not whisper of wheat and harvest, it groans with iron and stone. For 2 centuries, Donbass was the engine of empires, feeding factories, fueling wars, forging steel that built the cities of the Soviet dream. It was a land of workers, of miners who descended each day into the belly of the earth, who carried the dust of coal in their lungs, whose hands bore the calluses of survival. It was also a land of bitterness, where Soviet propaganda once promised dignity but delivered exploitation, where the collapse of the USSR left empty factories, unpaid wages, and a generation betrayed. When Ukraine was born in 1991, Donbass was part of it, but uneasily. Its identity was fractured, Russian language was dominant, nostalgia for Soviet strength lingered, and Moscow's shadow still loomed. The mines and mills stood as monuments to a past that felt stolen. And into this fracture, the fire was lit. After Crimea was taken, the Kremlin's gaze turned to Donbass. The play was more chaotic here, more violent, less clean than the peninsula's swift annexation. Strange figures appeared again, masked men with Russian weapons but no official flags. Buildings in Donetsk, in Luhansk, in Sloviansk were seized. New republics were declared, names scrawled across banners, the Donetsk People's Republic, the Luhansk People's Republic. It seemed absurd, almost theatrical. But behind the masks were real weapons, and behind the chaos was Moscow's hand. Kiev responded, launching what it called an anti-terrorist operation. But this was not terror in the abstract. It was war. Tanks rolled into eastern towns. Villages became fortresses. Trenches were dug into farmland. Shells fell on streets where children once played. The cold heart of Ukraine became a furnace of death. The world watched, half believing it was only a local conflict, a civil unrest, a quarrel on the margins. But Donbass was never just about Donbass. It was about Ukraine's survival. About Russia's refusal to let go. About Europe's borders being tested in the fire. And the fire consumed. In 2014, the battle for Donetsk airport raged for months. Once a modern terminal of glass and steel, it became a ruin, walls shattered, runways cratered. Ukrainian soldiers who defended it, called cyborgs for their endurance, held on until the very end, becoming symbols of resistance. But the airport fell. What had been a gateway to the world became a tomb of twisted metal. In the town of Ilovaisk, encircled Ukrainian forces were promised safe passage by Russian-backed fighters. Instead, as they retreated, they were cut down in a massacre. The fields outside the town were littered with bodies, and the betrayal burned into memory. Later, in 2015, at Debaltseve, another encirclement, another inferno. Entire units trapped, fighting street to street, rail yard to rail yard, until the city itself was reduced to ash. And above it all, one moment seared itself into the world's gaze. July 2014. A passenger jet, Malaysia Airlines flight MH17, crossing the skies over Donbass. A missile streaked upward. The plane fell. Nearly 300 souls, civilians from across the globe, scattered over fields of sunflowers. Their luggage, their toys, their lives broken on the soil of a war they never knew existed. The world could no longer look away. But even as bodies fell, politics played its cruel games. Minsk I, Minsk II. Ceasefires declared, broken, declared again. Lines drawn and redrawn. Villages switching hands, then abandoned. A war frozen, but never ended. For the people of Donbass, it was not frozen. It was daily life. Houses reduced to rubble. Schools closed. Water lines cut. Miners who once went underground now huddled in basements as shells fell. Old women cooking borscht on open fires among ruins. Children who could name the sound of artillery better than the names of constellations. The fire of Donbass did not simply burn. It smoldered, year after year, sinking deep into the earth like coal seams. And always, beneath the chaos, the question, was Donbass Ukraine's heart, or Russia's claim? Was it a rebellion of locals, or a war by proxy? The truth was both, and neither. It was a war born of fracture, sustained by interference, poisoned by memory. For Ukraine, Donbass became both wound and shield. A wound that bled endlessly, but also a shield that held back Russia's reach. For Russia, it was a lever, a pressure point, a way to keep Ukraine unstable, to keep it in pain. And for the world, Donbass was a warning. That borders drawn in treaties could be undone in fire. That peace could be shattered not with declarations, but with shadows and denials. The furnace burned through years of stalemate. 2014, 2015. 2016, the war dragged on. Forgotten by headlines, but not by those who lived beneath its smoke. A low, grinding conflict, without victory, without end. And yet, in that furnace, Ukraine was forged. The army that entered Donbass in 2014 was unprepared, undertrained, uncertain. The army that emerged, hardened by years of trenches and battles, was something different, experienced, resilient, ready. Donbass was not only a place of destruction. It was a crucible. But crucibles do not cool easily. The fire that smoldered there would, in time, ignite again, brighter, deadlier, uncontained. For Donbass was not the end of war. It was the rehearsal. The prelude to something greater. The furnace glowed in the east, but beyond it, in Moscow, darker plans were already being forged. The furnace of Donbass glowed, its embers refusing to die. Smoke hung in the valleys, in the towns, in the lungs of children who had grown up knowing nothing else but the thud of artillery and the silence after. For nearly a decade, Donbass was both battlefield and limbo, a place where war was constant, but never final, where lives continued in the shadows of ruins, as though the world had decided to leave time unfinished there. Yet beyond the trenches, beyond the shattered cities of the east, something else was forming. Not a peace, but a stillness. The stillness before a storm. The world, by then, had learned to look away. Ukraine's war had slipped into the background noise of geopolitics. Headlines no longer lingered on shelling in Avdiivka, or funerals in Mariupol. Diplomats spoke of frozen conflict. Analysts debated gas pipelines and sanctions, as though suffering could be measured in cubic meters and contracts. But in the villages near the front, nothing was frozen. Men still carried rifles through the mud of trenches. Women still patched roofs shattered by rockets. Graves multiplied quietly, rows of wooden crosses sprouting in fields. Life was not paused, it was ground down, slow, weary, relentless. And in Kiev, the question deepened, how long could Ukraine endure like this, half at war, half at peace? How long could a nation bleed without collapsing, or transforming into something unrecognizable? In Moscow, the question was different. Donbass was never the goal, not fully. It was a wound inflicted, a pressure point applied. But wounds can fester. And by 2019, the Kremlin began to calculate anew. The Kremlin watched Ukraine's shifts. The election of Volodymyr Zelensky, a comedian-turned-president, who promised peace, who won with the laughter of crowds and the hope of mothers who dreamed their sons might finally return home. Zelensky spoke of dialogue, of ending the war, of finding a path beyond endless trenches. But hope is fragile, and promises meet walls. The guns in Donbass did not fall silent. The Kremlin did not yield. And Zelensky, once mocked as an outsider, began to harden. The boyish performer grew into a wartime president before the war itself had even fully returned. Meanwhile, Russia watched with growing unease as Ukraine leaned westward. Small steps at first, closer ties with the European Union, whispers of NATO cooperation, reforms that tethered Kiev more tightly to Brussels and Washington. To Moscow, each step was a betrayal, a reminder that Ukraine, the so-called brother nation, was slipping further away, becoming something else. And for a Russian state built on memory, on empire, on the illusion of eternal borders, this was intolerable. The twilight years between Donbass and the storm were years of preparation. Russia rearmed, modernized, tested its forces in Syria, paraded missiles through Red Square. Propaganda grew louder, speaking of Nazi Kiev, of oppressed Russian speakers, of historic lands stolen by outsiders. The language was not new, it echoed from older wars, older excuses, but it was sharpened, refined, drilled into the public until belief blurred with desire. In the east of Ukraine, passports were handed out by Moscow. Russian citizenship distributed like seeds, sowing loyalty in soil already broken. Thousands took them, out of necessity or fear, binding the region more tightly to Russia's grasp. And in Kiev, drones buzzed in the skies, cyber attacks struck government offices, disinformation seeped into every corner. The war was already widening, but quietly, like water filling cracks in ice. Ordinary Ukrainians sensed something. They spoke of it in kitchens, in marketplaces, in whispers carried by wind, something was coming. Soldiers on the front line saw unusual troop movements across the border. Families noticed the tightening grip of propaganda from Russian channels. Farmers saw convoys on distant roads, black silhouettes against the horizon. It was twilight, yes. But twilight can fall before night, or before dawn. No one yet knew which would come. The years stretched on. Minsk agreements remained in place, but only as paper ghosts. Diplomats spoke of red lines. Generals measured distances in kilometers. The border grew heavier with tanks, artillery, armor. And then came 2021. The year the stillness broke. Russian forces massed near Ukraine's frontiers in numbers not seen in decades. At first, the world thought it a bluff, a display of muscle, a negotiation tactic. But the numbers grew, 100,000, 200,000, more. Columns of armor stretched for miles. Camps appeared in the snows of Belarus. Ships prowled the Black Sea. The twilight thickened, until it was almost night. Yet even then, in the last months, in the last days, many did not believe. Wars of that scale belong to history books, to grainy black and white photographs, not to the present. Europe had convinced itself that such darkness could not return, that trade and treaties had tamed the continent's old demons. But Ukraine felt it. Like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. The air changes. The silence deepens. Animals grow restless. The sky darkens, even when the sun still shines. That was Ukraine in late 2021, early 2022. Standing in the half-light of history. A nation at the edge of something vast, something terrible. And then, the storm broke. But that is another chapter. It began, as storms often do, not with a roar, but with silence. In the deep hours of a February night, the air above Ukraine grew heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Roads lay empty. Border towns slept uneasily. In Kiev, people dreamed ordinary dreams. In Kharkiv, children lay wrapped in blankets. In Mariupol, the sea lapped against the shore, unknowing. And then, the sky fell. Missiles streaked across the dark, fire tearing open the horizon. Explosions blossomed in the distance, then closer, then everywhere at once. The thunder of war returned to Europe in a single, orchestrated instant. Airfields struck. Barracks shattered. Cities trembled awake under sirens, under glass breaking, under the sudden reality that history had not ended after all, it had only been waiting. The invasion had begun. Not a shadow war, not a frozen conflict. A full-scale descent into chaos. Columns of tanks rolled across the borders, their iron tracks grinding into Ukrainian soil. From Belarus they came, from Russia they came, from Crimea they came, converging like rivers into a single flood. Helicopters skimmed treetops, dropping men into the outskirts of Kiev. Paratroopers fell like black seeds onto open fields. Bridges were seized. Roads cut. The storm moved fast, as though designed to end the war before Ukraine could even grasp that it had started. But Ukraine grasped it immediately. The first days blurred into a haze of shock and resistance. Families crammed into subway tunnels as makeshift shelters, clutching bags, children, pets. In the cold light of the platforms, strangers huddled together, listening to the echoes of bombs through the earth. Above, Kiev streets filled with barricades, men and women carrying rifles, bottles turned into weapons, buses turned into walls. The Russian plan had been swift decapitation, Kiev surrounded, government dissolved, the nation broken. But war has a way of defying plans. The city did not fall. The president did not flee. Zelensky, the performer turned leader, appeared on screens across the world, standing in the dark streets of his capital. His voice was steady, "I am here. We are not laying down arms. We will defend our country." In that moment, Ukraine's survival became defiance. Elsewhere, the invasion carved deep scars. Kharkiv, so close to the Russian border, shook under relentless shelling. Apartment blocks burst into flame. Schools collapsed into rubble. Civilians dug through ruins with bare hands, searching for neighbors, for children. Mariupol was cut off, the city encircled, its people trapped without food, without water, without escape. The furnace of Donbass now seemed almost distant compared to this, war not as a simmer, but as a firestorm. Highways choked with refugees, millions moving westward in endless convoys of cars, buses, and footsteps. Mothers carried infants through snow. Grandmothers clutched plastic bags filled with what little they could salvage of their lives. Borders overflowed. Europe awoke to the largest refugee crisis since the Second World War. And still, Ukraine resisted. In the forests near Kiev, ambushes erupted. Farmers towed abandoned tanks with tractors. Villages rose up to repel soldiers. The Russian machine, designed for swift conquest, began to stall. Bridges blown apart slowed its progress. Roads turned to mud swallowed its armor. Columns stretched too long became prey to strikes from the shadows. The invasion was not a march, but a grind. And in that grind, the myth of invincibility began to fray. Yet, the cost was unbearable. The sky itself became a predator. Missiles rained down not only on soldiers, but on theaters, hospitals, bread lines. The air raid siren became a permanent soundtrack, its rising wail stitched into the nervous system of a nation. Each morning began with the question, which city would burn today? The world watched in horror, but also in disbelief. Nuclear power plants shelled. Civilians executed in streets. Mass graves uncovered in towns once occupied. Images too stark, too raw, returned to Europe's consciousness, images thought buried with the 20th century. The new Bloodlands had fully arrived. And yet, amid destruction, a strange light grew. Ukraine did not collapse. Its army held. Its people fought. Its president became a symbol. The world, hesitant at first, rallied. Weapons, aid, sanctions, all began to flow. The war, meant to be over in days, stretched into weeks, then months, then years. The sky had fallen. But out of the rubble, a new defiance rose. This was no longer just a regional war. This was the fracture of an era, the unraveling of illusions, the return of shadows once thought defeated. The invasion of Ukraine was not only an assault on land. It was an assault on memory, on history, on the fragile hope that the blood-soaked ground of Europe might one day rest. Instead, the soil drank again. But the storm was not done. The invasion was only its opening act. The war, like all wars, was about to spread, deepen, metastasize. And in the coming chapters, the fire would only grow. The invasion did not stop at Ukraine's borders. Its shockwaves rippled outward, striking nerves across the globe. The fall of missiles in Kiev was heard in Warsaw, in Berlin, in London, in Washington. The world, lulled for decades into a belief that war on such a scale was relic, found itself staring into an abyss that had never truly gone away. The war was no longer local. It was planetary. In Europe, the old fear returned, the fear of Russian tanks rolling westward, of borders erased overnight, of the Cold War's ghost awakening in full. Nations that had dismantled their armies after the collapse of the Soviet Union scrambled to rearm. NATO, once dismissed as obsolete, reassembled with urgency. Sweden and Finland, long neutral, rushed toward the alliance, as though walls could be built against fire. Gas pipelines became weapons. The flow of energy, once thought secure, turned into leverage, into blackmail. Cities in Germany and Italy suddenly realized how deeply they had bound themselves to Russian oil, Russian gas, Russian dependence. Winter grew colder, darker. The lights of Europe flickered as the war in Ukraine crept into kitchens, factories, and living rooms. Across the Atlantic, America stirred from its slumber. For years it had pivoted away, distracted by other rivals, other battles. But Ukraine pulled it back, reminded it of unfinished business in Europe. Weapons shipments crossed the ocean, javelins, drones, artillery, missiles. Aid packages soared into billions. Washington framed the war not merely as defense of a nation, but as defense of the entire idea of democracy against the return of empire. And so, the proxy lines hardened. America and its allies on one side. Russia and its shadow partners on the other. Ukraine became not only a battlefield, but a symbol. But symbols have costs. While the West armed Ukraine, Russia turned east. To Beijing, to Tehran, to Pyongyang. New alliances emerged in shadows, transactions sealed in secret. Drones from Iran, whispers of shells from North Korea, promises from China unspoken but felt. The war became a marketplace of global rivalries, each weapon fired in Donbass or Mariupol echoing far beyond Ukraine's soil. This was no longer only about maps. It was about systems. About futures. About whose vision of the 21st century would dominate. Meanwhile, in Africa, in the Middle East, in South America, the war's ripples reached through food and grain. Ukraine, the breadbasket, saw its fields scarred by mines, its ports choked by blockades. Ships laden with wheat sat trapped in the Black Sea, their cargoes spoiling as distant countries waited. Prices soared. Bread vanished from markets in Cairo, in Lagos, in Beirut. Hunger stirred unrest, and unrest bred instability. The war fed chaos in lands thousands of miles away. Even the ocean was not spared. The Black Sea, once a corridor of commerce, turned into a contested battlefield. Naval drones slipped silently across its waters. Warships were struck. Ancient ports burned. The shadow of wider escalation loomed, that one stray missile, one sinking ship, could ignite a conflict too vast to contain. The nuclear shadow, too, crept closer. From Moscow came veiled threats, words chosen like knives, escalation, consequences, all options on the table. Submarines moved beneath polar waters. Missiles were paraded across Red Square, gleaming under the sun. The old fear, mushroom clouds, cities erased in an instant, returned, whispering through the back of the world's mind. For decades, it had been unthinkable. Now, it was spoken again. The edge grew sharper. And yet, amid this tightening spiral, an unease grew. How had the world come here again, to this precipice of catastrophe? Was it hubris? Neglect? The arrogance of believing that history had been defeated? For 30 years, many thought the bloodlands of Europe had healed, that the ghosts had been laid to rest. But ghosts do not rest. They wait. And when the soil is not tended with care, they rise. Ukraine was not only fighting for itself. It was fighting to remind the world of its own fragility. Of how quickly civilization can unravel. And so the war stretched on, 1 year, then 2, then more. The furnace of Donbass still burned. The Black Sea still boiled. Kiev still stood, battered but unbroken. Russia still pressed, relentless, refusing retreat. And the world stood at the edge, staring downward into an abyss it once thought impossible. The war was no longer Ukraine's alone. It was the mirror in which the 21st century saw its own reflection, fractured, uncertain, shadowed by old fears reborn. And the question remained, unanswered, unsettling. Would the world step back from the edge? Or take the final step forward, into the abyss? The war dragged into winter. But this was no ordinary winter, no ordinary season of frost and snow. It was a winter shaped by fire, by the endless thunder of artillery, by the sparks of burning cities, by the black smoke that rose into the gray skies of Ukraine. The cold did not extinguish the war. It became part of it. The first snow fell upon the ruins. It did not fall gently, though it looked gentle to the eye. It fell like ash, like shrouds laid over corpses. White flakes covered the broken skeletons of apartment blocks, the husks of tanks frozen on the roadside, the twisted rails of bridges blasted apart. For a moment, winter seemed to hide the scars. But beneath the thin veil of snow, the fire still burned. Kiev prepared itself like a fortress wrapped in shadows. The streets dimmed as power stations were struck, plunging whole neighborhoods into darkness. Generators hummed, candles flickered in kitchens, wood smoke drifted through alleys. The people endured, bundled in coats inside their apartments, boiling water on small stoves, whispering to one another through the stillness. Above them, the sky remained alive with menace. Sirens wailed like a dirge, then silence, then the distant thud of impact. In Kharkiv, the cold was not simply weather, it was a weapon. Pipes burst, water froze, and the wind carried the scent of burning fuel from makeshift stoves. Mothers wrapped their children in blankets layered like armor, waiting for dawn that never seemed to come. In basements, in subway tunnels, families huddled together as though pressed back into the Stone Age, waiting out the nightly bombardments. In Mariupol, already a city of ghosts, winter was the final shroud. Rubble lay beneath snowdrifts, and the sea itself seemed darker, as though mourning the city swallowed by flame. Silence lay over its ruins, broken only by the crack of frost splitting through wreckage. But winter was not merciful to the soldiers either. On the front lines of Donbass, men crouched in trenches that filled with snow, then with mud when the snow melted. Their rifles froze, their boots stiffened, their breath turned to fog that hung in the air like a cloud. Yet the shells still came, night after night, hour after hour. There was no true rest, no true warmth. Fires flickered in dugouts where soldiers tried to dry socks and uniforms, but even flames seemed weak against the cold. And still, both sides fought on. Russians, sent forward with promises of glory, found themselves freezing in unprepared camps, their supply lines stretched thin. Ukrainian fighters, though better supplied, knew the cold was merciless to all. Frostbite became another enemy. The snow was both shield and executioner, hiding movements, muffling sounds, but also exposing the unprepared to its relentless grip. Winter in Ukraine has always been decisive in history. It halted Napoleon, crushed Hitler, and froze entire armies into monuments of hubris. Now, once again, winter returned as the silent general, favoring no one, punishing all. And yet, amidst the silence of ice, fire raged. Russia turned its strategy toward infrastructure, a campaign of darkness. Missiles rained upon power plants, substations, water lines. The aim was simple, to freeze Ukraine into surrender. To make homes colder than battlefields, to turn survival itself into war. But the people refused. In Kiev, concerts were held in candlelight. In Kharkiv, teachers taught in basements. In Odessa, cafes served tea in the dark. "We are still alive," the people whispered, as though defying the very season itself. Every blackout became a ritual of resistance, every flickering flame a declaration. This was the winter of fire, where fire meant both destruction and endurance. Fire from missiles, fire from wood stoves, fire from the spirit of those who refuse to be broken. Beyond Ukraine's borders, the world also shivered. Europe feared not only for Ukraine but for itself. Gas was rationed, bills rose like new burdens on families, factories slowed, governments scrambled to buy energy from distant lands. The war's cold hand stretched far, from Kiev to Berlin, from Donbass to Paris. Citizens across Europe felt the chill in their homes, realizing that Ukraine's suffering was, in a smaller way, their own. The propaganda war also froze and flared. Russian voices insisted the West was crumbling, that sanctions would starve Europe before Russia. Western leaders responded with unity, pledging weapons, aid, promises that Ukraine would not freeze alone. Yet behind closed doors, unease lingered. How long could this endurance last? How long could people, both in Ukraine and abroad, withstand the winter of fire? Inside Russia, the season carried another weight. Mothers mourned sons who would never return from the front. Coffins, sealed and silent, returned to villages where snow covered the roofs of wooden houses. Whispers spread through kitchens, through underground networks, through the digital ether. The Kremlin projected strength, but winter's bite reached into its own heart. The war was consuming not only Ukraine, but Russia itself. In this season, time felt frozen. Days blurred into one another, night after night of cold and fire, of silence and sudden thunder. The war seemed endless, as though caught in a cycle without escape. Yet beneath the despair, something hardened in Ukraine. The nation's will did not melt, it crystallized. The cold forged resolve. The people remembered past winters, the Holodomor famine, the Nazi occupation, the Soviet repressions. They remembered that their ancestors had survived worse, and that survival was itself a victory. To endure was to resist. To light a candle was to defy an empire. To hold one's ground in the snow was to carve one more line into the history of resilience. And so the winter of fire dragged on. Missiles fell. Candles burned. Children whispered stories in basements, while above them the snow fell quietly, indifferent, eternal. Fire raged in the night skies, and frost claimed the ground. The war did not pause. The world did not move forward. It simply froze, poised, waiting, enduring. The winter would pass, as all winters do. But what it left behind would not melt with the snow. The scars would remain. And when spring returned, the war would breathe again, hungrier than before. For winter was not the end. It was only the silence before the next storm. The seasons turned again. Winter yielded to spring, spring to summer, and still the war did not end. What was meant to be a blitz, a rapid conquest, had become something else entirely, a war without an end, a war that stretched like a shadow across the years. The invasion had become not a storm, but a climate. It was no longer only about battlefields. It was about attrition, about time itself grinding against bone and steel. The war had settled into the long rhythm of endurance. Not a war of weeks or months, but of years. Ukraine adapted to the rhythm first. Cities became both ruins and fortresses. Life was lived between sirens, between blackouts, between funerals. Children learned to study by candlelight, their notebooks filled with handwriting interrupted by the drone of alarms. Farmers sowed seeds in fields that had been scarred by shell craters, plowing around the wreckage of armored vehicles, scattering wheat where death had lingered. The war became background to life itself. A wedding would be held in a ruined church, vows spoken beneath shattered stained glass. A child's birthday celebrated in a basement, the laughter mixed with the dull echo of artillery. The ordinary and the catastrophic lived side by side, each refusing to yield to the other. The world watched, at first breathless, then gradually numbed. Headlines blazed with each new offensive, each new bombardment, but over time, fatigue seeped into the watchers. The war was still burning, but distant eyes grew weary. For Ukraine, the war was every breath. For the world, it became one crisis among many. The front lines hardened into scars across the map. Donbass remained the furnace, churning endlessly, consuming men and machines in battles that gained and lost villages measured not in miles, but in meters. The names of these places, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Severodonetsk, once unknown beyond their borders, became etched into global consciousness as symbols of attrition, of the grinding stalemate that swallowed armies. The long war was a war of logistics as much as fire. Ammunition shipments became lifelines. Supply chains stretched across continents. Factories in Europe, in America, in distant lands, churned out shells, rockets, drones, not only for Ukraine but to sustain a balance of endurance. For Russia too, weapons flowed in, sanctioned, hidden, bartered in shadows. The battlefield reached into global markets, into boardrooms, into negotiations held behind curtains. It was a war of drones in the sky, silent watchers that replaced birds. It was a war of trenches, where mud swallowed boots just as it had in wars a century earlier. It was a war of satellites, watching from above, tracking the heat signatures of tanks. It was a war of whispers, disinformation campaigns echoing through social media, truth twisted and refracted until reality itself seemed contested. The long war blurred time. Days became indistinguishable. Front lines shifted by inches, then shifted back. A town would be declared liberated, then lost, then fought over again. Maps became less about territory and more about persistence. The long war was not won by who advanced, but by who endured longest in the furnace. And as the war dragged on, the costs seeped deeper. Ukraine lost not only soldiers, but generations. The brightest, the strongest, the most determined were bled into the soil. Yet at the same time, new generations grew harder, sharper, raised in the crucible of war. A child who learned the sound of sirens before the sound of bells grew into a teenager who no longer feared the drone of engines overhead. A people who once sought peace at any cost now sought survival above all else. Russia too paid. Coffins returned to villages, silent reminders of the empire's hunger. Mothers whispered in kitchens, afraid but restless. Sanctions gnawed at the economy, slowly, like ice eating through timber. Yet the machinery of war pressed on, fueled by ambition, pride, and the inability to retreat. Both sides were trapped. Neither could win without breaking. Neither could stop without surrender. In the long war, the earth itself became exhausted. Forests were torn apart by shellfire. Fields lay poisoned with shrapnel. Rivers carried oil slicks from sunken machines. Animals roamed abandoned towns, their footsteps echoing in empty streets. The land, once called the breadbasket of Europe, became a scarred wilderness where life persisted only in fragments. Yet amidst the ruin, endurance bloomed stubbornly. Farmers returned to their fields, planting wheat where graves had been dug. Musicians gathered to play in the dark, their notes trembling but insistent. Writers chronicled the days, as though refusing to let the memory of endurance fade. The long war was not simply a struggle of armies. It was a struggle over memory itself, whether the story of Ukraine would be written in survival or in silence. The world, too, was reshaped by the long war. Alliances hardened, economies bent, energy shifted, weapons spread. The map of influence trembled, as though the entire global order was being slowly rewritten. For some, the war was a distant tragedy. For others, it was a mirror, reflecting futures that might yet come. And still, the fire burned. The war no longer felt like a storm. It felt like climate, an atmosphere that settled over the century, shaping all who breathed it. The long war was not measured in battles won or lost, but in the erosion of time, in the weariness that seeped into nations and souls alike. And as months turned to years, one truth became clear. The war was not ending. It was only becoming. The long war was not a pause before peace. It was the new rhythm of the age. The furnaces of Donbass, the blackouts of Kiev, the whispers in Russian kitchens, the drones above the trenches, the silent snow on Mariupol, all these were no longer moments. They were the heartbeat of an era. The long war was the 21st century written in blood and frost, fire and silence. And it was far from over. The war stretched onward, and as it did, shadows lengthened beyond the borders of Ukraine. For in every long war, there comes a moment when the present begins to dissolve into prophecy. What is fought today becomes an echo of what is yet to come. The soldiers who walked the trenches, the civilians who carried water by candlelight, the leaders who signed decrees in dimly lit chambers, all of them became actors in a story larger than themselves. The war was no longer simply about territory, nor sovereignty, nor even survival. It had become something else, something spectral, the shaping of the future through the blood of the present. And so the ghosts of the future began to stir. At night, in ruined cities, the air seemed to carry whispers of what might yet be. A mother holding her child beneath the rubble dreamt not only of the morning, but of generations unborn who would carry the scars of this age. A soldier, staring across no man's land at the faint flicker of enemy fire, wondered not only if he would live, but if his grandchildren would one day walk in peace, or fight the same war in another century. The war spoke forward, as much as it echoed backward. The ghosts of the Holodomor, of the Holocaust, of the famine years and the pogroms, they had risen earlier, shaping the present through the weight of memory. But now new ghosts were being written into existence. Ghosts of the future. Ghosts of children not yet born, who would inherit silence, loss, resilience, and rage. History was no longer only in the past. It was now a script being carved into tomorrow. One ghost walked with the weaponized sky. Drones that once belonged to science fiction now haunted villages, buzzing overhead with mechanical intent. The battlefield became a laboratory, and what was tested here would one day drift into other wars, other lands, other futures. This was the ghost of warfare itself, changing, mutating, becoming something that would outlast the men who first deployed it. Another ghost drifted in the corridors of power. Nations watched Ukraine and Russia locked in their long struggle, and in their silence or their speeches, they too were writing the shape of tomorrow. The alliances that hardened, the economies that fractured, the weapons that multiplied, all were shadows of futures yet to break open. The ghost of a divided world hovered, waiting to be born. And deeper still, there was the ghost of silence. The possibility of fatigue, of forgetting, of a war that would fade from headlines but persist in blood. This ghost whispered of indifference, of a world that might accept endless war as ordinary, just another background hum of the century. The ghosts gathered in the soil, in the smoke, in the frost. They gathered in the cracked windows of schools, in the empty shelves of libraries, in the photographs taped to ruined walls. They gathered in the dreams of the young, who had never known a world without war, and in the memories of the old, who had seen too many wars to believe in endings. In these ghosts, the line between past, present, and future dissolved. Ukraine's war was no longer only Ukraine's. It was humanity's mirror. A reflection of cycles we could not escape, or perhaps would not escape. For the ghost of the future is not bound by borders. It asks questions that have no easy answers. If a great war can erupt again in Europe in the 21st century, what other wars wait to be born? If the machinery of death grows sharper, smaller, faster, what will warfare look like when these tools spread across the globe? If alliances fracture, if democracies waver, if ambition triumphs over restraint, what kind of century will emerge from these ashes? The ghosts do not answer. They linger, watching, waiting. And so the future becomes haunted. Not by inevitability, but by possibility. Perhaps Ukraine will endure and stand, its survival becoming a beacon for centuries. Perhaps Russia will reshape itself in defeat or rise hardened in defiance. Perhaps the world will remember this war as the last of its kind, or as the first of something far worse. The ghosts of the future do not choose. They whisper, and they wait. And in the silence between battles, in the snow that falls on trenches, in the candlelit rooms where families whisper prayers, the truth takes shape. The war is not only a struggle for the present. It is a struggle over the very shape of the future itself. And the ghosts are watching. The ghosts are waiting. The ghosts are already here. When the guns finally fall silent, whether in months, years, or decades, what remains will not be victory. What remains will be ashes. And from these ashes, a new tomorrow must emerge. But what kind of tomorrow? That is the question that lingers like smoke over the ruins. For history has taught us that every war ends, but not every war ends cleanly. Some wars carve scars into nations that never close. Others end in silence, only to awaken again in another age. Ukraine's war carries within it both possibilities, the rebirth of a nation, and the endless cycle of destruction. Imagine the landscape when the fighting is over. Cities half ruined, their bones of concrete and steel jutting out against the sky. Forests laced with mines that will sleep for decades, waiting with silent malice for a misplaced step. Fields that once fed Europe, now craters of earth that yield only fragments of metal. This is the inheritance of ashes. The children who grow among these ruins will not know innocence as others do. Their lullabies will be sung to the rhythm of sirens. Their toys will be fragments of war, collected from the soil. Their games will be played in courtyards where shadows of buildings stand hollow. They will laugh, yes, children always laugh, but their laughter will echo differently, sharpened by memory. They are the tomorrow born of today's fire. And for the soldiers who survive, tomorrow will not bring relief. Many will walk as living ruins, carrying in their eyes the weight of what they have seen. They will sit at kitchen tables in silence, hands trembling over bread, unable to describe the horrors carved into their memories. They too will be part of the ashes, the human remnants of a war that consumed more than it could ever give. But ashes are not only endings. Ashes are also beginnings. From the charred remains of cities rise new architectures. From the broken order of old empires comes the fragile birth of new states. From the despair of defeat can emerge the hard, quiet strength of survival. Ukraine has known this cycle before. It has risen after famines, after purges, after invasions, after Chernobyl. Always, the ashes were there, and always, something grew from them. The question is not whether tomorrow will come, but what shape it will take. The ashes of tomorrow may hold three futures. One is the future of resilience. A Ukraine rebuilt, scarred but sovereign, standing as proof that destruction cannot erase identity. Its cities glowing again with light, its soil once more feeding millions, its people carrying forward the memory of war as a warning, not as a curse. Another is the future of fracture. A land divided, its wounds never healing, its people trapped between hostile powers. A frozen war, an uneasy ceasefire, a generation condemned to live in limbo. This is the tomorrow that smolders but never flames, a purgatory written into geography. And the third is the future of escalation. A war that spills outward, reshaping continents, rewriting alliances, awakening new conflicts far beyond Ukraine's borders. In this tomorrow, the ashes spread like wind-borne embers, igniting fields not yet touched by fire. The world watches, yet the world also waits. For what burns in Ukraine is not only Ukraine's burden. It is a mirror of what could come for us all. If tomorrow is born from these ashes, then tomorrow belongs to everyone who has seen the flames. And so the ashes of tomorrow whisper. They whisper of ruin, but also of renewal. They whisper of endings, but also of beginnings. They remind us that fire destroys, but it also clears the ground for seeds yet to be sown. In the end, tomorrow is not promised. Tomorrow is built. It is built from the ashes, with trembling hands and weary hearts, with visions of peace or shadows of war. And as the world leans into the uncertain dawn, the truth becomes clear. The ashes of tomorrow are not just Ukraine's. They belong to us all. Long after the guns have fallen silent, long after the soldiers have gone home, long after the headlines have faded from the world's restless attention, the land itself will remain. And the land remembers. The soil of Ukraine has always been more than earth. It is a palimpsest of memory, a layered manuscript written in blood, in famine, in harvest, in song. Each generation tills the same ground, yet beneath their feet lies the silent witness of centuries. Bones and seeds mingle together in the furrows, and the wind carries both the laughter of harvests and the cries of the lost. The land does not forget. It never has. Walk the fields of Poltava, and beneath the wheat lies the echo of cannons that shook Europe centuries ago. Stand in Babi Yar, and the silence itself will press upon you like a weight, as if the earth itself holds its breath in mourning. Step into Chernobyl's forests, where wolves roam through empty villages, and you will feel how memory endures even in abandonment. And now, in Mariupol, in Bakhmut, in Irpin, the land takes in new stories, new losses, new names carved into its memory. The rubble will be cleared, the buildings rebuilt, the streets renamed. But beneath it all, the land will still whisper the truth of what happened there. Generations from now, children will play where soldiers once bled. They will chase each other through courtyards rebuilt from ruins, unaware, at least at first, of the weight that lingers in the ground beneath their feet. Yet, as they grow, the stories will come to them. From grandparents, from monuments, from the silence of the fields. They will learn that their tomorrow was built upon ashes, and that the land itself carries both the wounds and the resilience of its people. This is Ukraine's fate, and perhaps its curse, to be the land that remembers. But remembrance is not only sorrow. It is also survival. For in remembering, a people guard themselves against erasure. In remembering, they keep alive the thread of identity, even when all else is stripped away. And in remembering, they offer a mirror to the world, a warning of how easily humanity repeats its darkest chapters. The war may end. The treaties may be signed. The maps may be redrawn. But the land will keep its memory. And through the land, so too will the people. The Dnipro will continue to flow, carrying reflections of skies both dark and golden. The forests will regrow, and in their shadows, old scars will slumber. The steppes will once more sway with wheat, bending in the wind like the breath of centuries. And beneath it all, unseen but eternal, the land will remember. The story of Ukraine is not only the story of war, but of endurance. It is the story of a nation that has been broken and rebuilt, starved and revived, silenced and yet never erased. Its land carries the weight of blood and famine, but also of harvests and rebirths. And as the world looks on, one truth remains: what happens here is never only here. Ukraine is a crossroads, a borderland, a place where empires clash and where futures are forged. Its soil has remembered for centuries, and it will remember for centuries more. And so we leave the story, not with an ending, but with a presence. The war continues, the ashes cool, the future waits. But the land, silent and eternal, watches and remembers. And if you walk its fields someday, if you listen closely in the stillness of night, you may hear it. The low, haunting voice of history itself, carried in the rustle of grass, the ripple of water, the breath of wind across the steppe. The land that remembers. The land that endures. The land that bleeds, and heals, and bleeds again. Ukraine. And now, as the journey fades, as the echoes of history soften into silence, let us breathe with the land. Close your eyes, if you will. Feel the weight of centuries begin to dissolve into quiet. The names, the battles, the suffering, all drifting like ash carried by a gentle wind. The land remembers, yes, but it also forgives in its own slow way. The grass grows over trenches. The rivers wash away blood. The ruins crumble into dust, and from dust, flowers bloom. What was unbearable becomes a whisper, and what was once deafening becomes a murmur in the soil. Listen to that murmur. It is steady, patient, eternal. It says, "We remain." Imagine the wide Ukrainian steppe at night. The sky stretched endlessly above, scattered with stars that burn like ancient embers. Somewhere in the distance, the Dnipro flows, its current carrying centuries within its waters, a liquid memory winding toward the sea. You stand in the stillness, the air cool against your skin, and for a moment, the war, the suffering, the noise of the world falls away. What remains is breath. What remains is earth. What remains is the quiet promise that even after fire, life returns. The stories we have told tonight, of famine, of fire, of war, they do not end in despair. They end in a question: what will we build from the ashes? You need not answer now. You need only rest. The land itself will keep the memory safe, until you are ready to return to it. So let the weight slip from your shoulders. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let the rhythm of history slow into the rhythm of sleep. For beyond the sorrow, beyond the ruins, beyond the shadows of war, there is still tomorrow. And tomorrow, however fragile, is enough. Drift, now, into silence. Drift, into rest. The land remembers for you. And in its memory, you are safe.